Welcome back to the Stand Like Men podcast. I'm Logan Ingram.
I'm Daniel Schallenberg.
And we are diving into episode 5, Imposter Syndrome. That's what we're going to be talking about this week.
Yeah.
I don't know a single human on the planet that hasn't dealt with it at some point in their life. And I think it keeps us from becoming the men we're supposed to be.
So Logan, what is imposter syndrome?
So imposter syndrome, a good way to look at it is perfect example is here in this podcast. I am recording a podcast for the first time in my entire life. We're on episode 5, and some days I feel really great about it, like we're doing something great. And then other days I think, man, everything I'm saying has been said before. No one cares. No one's going to listen. Nobody knows me. Nobody knows us. Nobody knows this name. And you can talk yourself out of a lot. By feeling like you're an imposter in your arena. And so we need to combat that, because if I fell into those types of thinking, which I have in my life, then nothing would get done. I think I've talked about it before, but a story about when we were going to church in Texas and we ended up leaving the church because there was nothing there was no men's ministry or anything going on at the time. Elder asked me why we were leaving, and I told him all of that stuff. And he said, why don't you do it? Talk about ultimate imposter syndrome. What do you mean? I'm 26 years old, 25 years old. I don't know anything. And looking back now, it didn't matter. It didn't matter I didn't know anything. I could have started it because I've learned a ton. And that when you start trying to teach something, you learn an immense amount of information. It's almost better to be the teacher. You get more information and you actually grow a ton when you decide to teach or speak about something that you're not maybe in your mind an expert on. That also doesn't mean that everyone else that's listening to you doesn't know as much as you or more than you or less than you. You never know, because I've learned this as a parent, is me as a parent can tell my son or daughter or other son anything 1,000 times. They won't hear it. Same words can come out of my mouth 1,000 times. Then maybe one of their friends says it. Doesn't matter. Then maybe somebody that they have some shred of respect for outside of that immediate circle says it to them. Whether it's their tone of voice, whether it's some emotional connection they have to that person, whatever it is, it sinks in right then. If they felt like, well, I can't tell him this, their parents have told them that a million times and said, well, you don't have the ability to make change there. Well, then maybe that wouldn't have ever sunk in. And we can't live like that. We've got something to say. We got to say it. It's part of why we're doing this podcast. We feel like we got something to say. We don't know if it's been said before. Some of it is clearly we're bringing up stories that have already been told, stuff that's on social media, questions that people have already asked. Yeah. But I hope that somehow we're able to communicate in a way differently where people can hear it and encourage folks to not give in to that imposter syndrome. So, like, what's a good example of a situation that maybe has triggered those feelings in your mind? Besides podcast, I already ruined that one for you.
Oh, well, I mean, I was going to jump in on when you're talking about the podcast and how you don't feel like you know what you're doing and you don't feel like you're qualified. Like, I know that I'm not qualified
100%
to do this. And so, like, I know I'm not qualified but I have a side hustle that I do photos and videos. And so inevitably, as I'm making these videos, I will look at this and I'm like, this is utter trash. This is so gross because I should have put the camera in this position. I should have been filming this way. I should have stopped here and I should have opened up. Like, I should have done this over here. I should have done a different f-stop. I should have noticed this when I was at the thing, because I know more. I knew a lot. And so my wife would come in and she'd watch it and she's like, it looks great. Like, this is a really good video. I'm like, yeah, but you're wrong. Yeah. Like, I wish you were right, but you just don't know that. You don't know how wrong you are. And that's just so precious. And it's just like looking at it and I guess it was just fear that what I was producing wasn't good enough. And I was afraid that someone was going to figure out that I didn't belong there, that I didn't belong in that field. And then when someone figures it out, then they're going to be like, oh, you don't actually belong here. And then I wouldn't be able to make the videos that I really enjoy making, or taking pictures that I really enjoy taking. And I wouldn't be able to do that anymore. Now it was just fear that I was going to be found out as a fraud. And so, but like my wife, we do try, I mean, she is partial, she is biased, but like when we talk about things, like we try to be impartial as much as possible. And she's like, yeah, this is really good. And like, she'll tell me if it's crap. Like she'll point out and say, I don't like that at all. This looks awful. This transition is not good. And so like, she'll have me fix it. And so I trust her when she says, hey, fix these 3 things, but then I won't trust her when she says it's good. Like, I wish you were right.
Yeah.
But it doesn't meet my standard. It's like, well, what standard am I setting for myself? I'm setting a standard for that's impossible to reach in those situations.
Yeah. So we can effectively say that imposter syndrome stems from fear.
I think so.
Yeah, I think that's 100% what it is.
We talked about that recently, I think, on a very recent episode.
Yes, we did. And I think I've mentioned it before, but me and a group of dads are taking our sons through kind of this journey, becoming a man journey. Mm-hmm. And they're freshmen in high school right now. And we had a breakfast for them this last Saturday. And I wanted the boys to get together and learn something about the others. Mm-hmm. Like they go off on their own, free from the dads, and just talk about each one of them, say something that they love. That's not like, it's kind of obscure. Like maybe, like mine was cello music. Huh. Like I absolutely love cello music.
Yeah.
And probably if anybody that knows me, you would never, ever guess that, most likely.
I would not have.
But then the other part of it was I wanted them to talk about something that scares them to death. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about a snake or a spider. Like those are low hanging. That's just a gimme. Mm-hmm. Not talking about that. I want these boys to go deep. In mine, and it ended up being pretty much every dad there, is imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. I am deathly afraid that the people important to me are going to wake up one day and realize I'm a fraud. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid that my wife is going to wake up one day and go, you're not the man that you said you are or were, or that I married. Mm-hmm. And then she's out. My kids are going to wake up one day and go, you're not a good dad. And in business, every day in business, I talk to people who are very successful, and I'll look around the room sometimes in our meetings and go, what in the world am I doing in this room? Mm-hmm. How did I get here? Like, I'm really grateful that I'm there. It's like, why do these people, like, what's wrong with these people? Mm-hmm. If they knew me, they would not let me in here.
Yeah.
And it's funny that since I've started this path of growth, it's almost like I feel that even more now. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because doors have opened, because I've put in a bunch of work and I'm taking bigger risk and pushing myself further, that you're probably going to feel that a little more. The more you push yourself into uncomfortable situations, the more that fear is going to build up, and you're going to say, I don't belong here. And I don't ever want us to feel that way in our families and in moments where we can make a difference in the world. You know, in doing these seminars with my dad, I mean, we've spoken to people who are probably anywhere from 80 years old down to 9, 8. And I look around the room and go, I don't have anything to teach these people. Like, I don't, like, why? I don't know why they're listening.
Yeah.
like in my mind, I'm like, if you got on your phone, I'd understand. Mm-hmm. Like, I get it. And that's just fear. That's just my terrible self-talk, you know. Mm-hmm. But I'm hoping that, going back to the planting seeds piece that we bring up a lot, I'm hoping that that's what's going on. Is I'm just saying yes. You know, when I feel called to do something, when I feel like God is calling me to do something, that I step out in faith in that, whether I am an expert and know enough or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's tons of biblical reasons why we should do that. Like, check this out. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them."
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's already been laid out. Like, it has nothing to do with us. And I was talking to a guy here in town just an hour ago, and he was bringing up the saying, you know, God doesn't call the prepared, he prepares the called.
I was going to mention that later on.
You know, and it reminds us that we're purposefully created by God for a unique calling.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we feel prepared or not, God is using us for a reason in that moment.
And you look at practically every individual described in the Bible, like Moses, Abraham, Noah, like Peter, James, and John. Like, Peter was a fisherman, and yet Jesus called him, and Peter was not prepared to go out and preach sermons to thousands of people.
No.
He was not prepared to go out and eventually become a martyr for Jesus. Like, Jesus called him and said, "Now that you're with me, I'm going to prepare you. Now that you're with me, I'm going to qualify you for the tasks that I have for you." You look at Gideon, and Gideon was sitting in like a threshing floor, and he was sitting there like hiding from, I think it was the Philistines. You know, he was hiding from the enemy, just cowering in fear. And the angel of the Lord came to Gideon and said, "Hey, you're a mighty warrior." And Gideon's like,
"Oh, Gideon's one of my favorites."
Yeah. He's like, "Psh, what are you on?
I'm the least in my clan.
I'm the least. I'm in the least clan. I'm the least in my clan."
Yeah.
Like, I'm literally a nobody. And you come in here with this junk saying that I'm a mighty warrior. No, I'm not. And then look at where he went. Like, God led him and prepared him to lead Israel into freedom. And the same can be said with practically every character in Scripture. Is God, they were not ready. They had no idea what they were going to do. They were not qualified to do the things that they were going to do, but God qualified them after he called them.
Yeah.
He doesn't choose the qualified. He qualifies the chosen, is the way I heard it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and so you hear it like that and you're like, oh, well, I don't feel qualified to do this podcast, or I don't feel qualified to talk to people about being a man because I know my own flaws, but that doesn't mean that I haven't been called to do that.
Yeah. One thing I think about a lot in that story about me going to church there in Texas is I know exactly what happened. I said no.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to do it. We left. We jumped around for a little bit. We ended up here after many years in a great spot. Good, great. Everything, I mean, it's fine. Everything turned out fine. I think about what didn't happen though. You know, what didn't happen because I said no to that. And we'll never know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but it's an interesting thought.
Mm-hmm.
What could have happened if I had said yes?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of growth could I have experienced quicker if I'd said yes and dove in on these studies myself so that I could talk to other men about them? So let's answer this question. How does fear of being found out as an imposter affect our willingness to take risks or seek new opportunities? I mean, that one, clearly I didn't
Mm-hmm.
take that risk. The imposter syndrome kept me from taking that risk. There's been deals, business opportunities that I've had where imposter syndrome kept me from pursuing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't happen, and I regret it now.
Mm-hmm.
I regretted just not trying, you know, just because of a little bit of fear. I've talked about it before too, is, you know, I've gotten to the point in my life where I can't not do something because I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the only reason, it's not a good enough reason.
Mm-hmm.
If there's financial reasons, if there's emotional reasons, if there's, you know, familial reasons, time constraints, whatever it is, I can say no. because of those things. But if it comes down to it and none of those things are a real problem, maybe inconvenient, that's not a problem. And the only thing standing in my way is fear of failure, fear of not knowing enough, fear of being found out that I'm a fraud, whatever. It's not good enough for me anymore. Because I can't look my wife and my kids in the face one day when they're looking at me and asking me why we didn't do those things. Like I don't want to answer to my kids when they say, "Oh, Dad, I remember you telling a story about this deal. Why didn't you do that?" I don't want my answer to be, "I was afraid." It's just, it doesn't seem good enough, because we're called 365 times in the Bible to be strong and courageous and to not be afraid. So I think it's quite important to not allow fear to take hold.
My problem is I'm very good at justifying things. Like I walk into a situation, I'm like, I'm afraid of this. And then I start justifying. And I'm like, I'm not afraid. I'm looking at other things. And I start pointing at all of the other things that are the reasons that I'm not doing. Reasons was in air quotes if you're not watching on YouTube. I start justifying myself. So in college, like when I went to college, my first thought was, I want to be a youth minister. And the youth group was very important to me growing up, did a lot of good for me in my high school years. And I wanted to be a youth minister. And then I get to college and I'm like, I don't want to do it. And like the only reason I didn't do it was because I was afraid.
Yeah.
But I started justifying the reason why. And I didn't want to say that it was because I was afraid. And I didn't want to say because I was afraid of, it wasn't that I was afraid of, I wasn't afraid of being a youth minister. I was afraid of doing the work to get to be a youth minister. Like the classes I was going to have to take and the things I was going to have to do in order to become a youth minister. I was afraid of that. But I started justifying myself and I started saying, well, there's this complication and then there's this complication. And then there's this one verse, and I was very good at misappropriating scripture. And there's this one verse that said teachers are held to a higher standard. And I'm like, oh, that scares me. I'm not going to do that. And so I was able to like justify my fear and make my fear, like I tried to like elevate my fear a little bit. And that's kind of goes into pride that I was going to ask you about later, but like I made my fear more substantial than it needed to be. And I wrongly put scripture with it so that when people ask me like, I thought you were going to be youth minister. I'm like, yeah, well, thinking that would make it better, make the reason why I'm not a youth minister better. But the problem is how many people were not helped because I was afraid and I abandoned that goal. And that's something that we don't always see. Like it's easy to see, okay, you can look at the doctor and say, how many lives have you saved? And the doctor can point at this person I did. And like, they can list off the dozens or so people that they helped and that they saved and that they made well. You can't always do that with the person who doesn't become the doctor.
Yeah.
Like the person who wanted to become a doctor and didn't, like how many lives did you save? I don't know. Cause they may not have. How many lives, or the question becomes, how many lives could you have saved?
Yeah.
And like, it's an impossible question to answer because they didn't follow that path, but why didn't you follow the path? It's because you were afraid.
Yeah. How does comparison to others play into your imposter syndrome? Comparing yourself to what others have achieved or in that field or whatever.
I mean, I just assume that they know what they're doing.
Yeah. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
We always all assume that.
And I know like this podcast is low hanging fruit and we keep coming back to it, but like I assumed, cause like how we got together, how we started doing this podcast is, your dad was doing a seminar. He's like, I'd really like to record this. And he knew that his wife knew that I did videos, and she's like, hey, would you record this? I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. The two of us had a conversation about like, how best to do that and what the videos can be used for. And I suggested, hey, we should do a podcast or something like that, or a vlog of some sort, like having consistent content that we're putting out, not just the seminar that he's doing like every couple months, but like doing it like consistently and having new content every time, so that even if you go to this, like even if you've gone to the seminar, there's still something new to hear. And in that conversation, I said, like, let's do this podcast, but I want to be part of this. And so I thought I was riding y'all's coattails into this podcast, but in later conversations with you, I've realized that you also had this feeling of inadequacy, and you also felt like you were not worthy of talking about this. You did not have the authority to talk about this subject with people. And so, like, I guess the comparison was like, I looked at you and I'm like, well, he's got it figured out. And he's already like, I'll be writing his coattails, and like, I've got some things to talk about because I've been working with youth group for 10 years or so. I've been working with college guys for maybe 5 years. And like, I know I've seen a lot, and I've had to talk to guys a lot about being men. So I have some things to contribute, but ultimately, like, I'm just going to be writing y'all's coattails. And I'm like, y'all are going to be doing most of the content. I'll just throw in some stuff every once in a while. And so, yeah, that's where comparison gets me, is like, I assume other people have it figured out.
Yeah.
And maybe that goes back to childhood. And it's a joke I hear on social media periodically of people being like, as a kid, I always assumed that adults knew what they were doing and had everything figured out. And now I'm an adult, and I realize that nobody knows what's going on. I'm like, oh,
yeah. There's some wisdom to be gained with age. Yeah, no doubt.
There is some wisdom, but like, ultimately, like, most everybody you meet is just kind of trying the best that they can and making it up as they go.
Yeah, absolutely. And this fear and even the comparison piece, Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. And the comparison piece, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive their inheritance as your reward. That reminds us not to compare with others, but we're working towards something different. We're working as if for the Lord, and that's the only comparison that we need. Mm-hmm. And of course, social media and any other forms of media on the internet right now that are readily available, even if it's even if people are trying to purposefully show the mistakes and show the real side, you automatically assume they have it together. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just, I don't know if it's human nature. I don't know, or if it's just the nature of the media. But, for a long time, Instagram, Facebook, all of that was literally, it's just a highlight reel. And that's what reels are. It's highlight reels. Yeah. And so you're just highlighting the moments of your day, your life, or the good things that happen to you. And then if that's all you see from somebody else, then you think that's just who they are. Mm-hmm. You don't see the behind the scenes stuff. And
you don't see how many takes it took them to get that shot.
You know how many takes it took to get a closing statement out of one of our latest episodes. You just hear the end closing statement.
If you want to talk about having to edit, going into this podcast, I'm just going to be honest. Like, I thought that my hope was that we'd start the podcast, and episodes are about 25, 30, 35 minutes long, and we just run for 30 minutes or so and then stop it. And then we just slap a intro and outro on it. And then we put it on YouTube. And little did I know how much I would have to stop the podcast and think of words, or stop the podcast and say, that doesn't make sense at all, and have to go back. So like, you talk about imposter syndrome. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but like you talk about imposter syndrome of not even being able to talk when the medium that we are presenting this information on is talking. We have the fancy microphones, but I don't know. I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, you did not. What?
Good.
What are some steps that you've personally taken to help push through that feeling? Like if it's come up, like even with this podcast, we can tackle this one again if you want to, or another example of where you were able to convince yourself to move beyond that.
What ended up helping me get past it and finally deciding that I'm not going to be a slave or victim or hostage. I'm not going to be a hostage to imposter syndrome anymore. Is I find it, I kind of personified the imposter syndrome, and I'm like, it's almost like this voice is talking to me and telling me that I'm not good enough and telling me that I'm not meeting the standard. And so whatever the standard, quote unquote, that I put in my mind. And so I wrote a script. I'm like, that's kind of a neat idea. And I'm just going to like write it out as if I'm having a conversation with this entity. And so I wrote a script, and it was basically like, it was autobiographical, where like I'm having this conversation with the entity and he's like, you're worthless. You suck. You're not meeting the standard. I'm like, I know this is not good enough. And then I introduced my wife and my son as characters, and how they said, actually, this is really good. Do you need to get that? Okay. I introduced my wife and my son as characters, and like I had them say the things that they always say, which is like, this is really good. I really like it. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And then the voices in the background saying, yeah, but you know that they're wrong because you're not meeting the standard. And I'm like, yeah, it's never going to be good enough. And then as I'm writing this thing, I get to the point, I'm like, how do I end it? Like, what am I going to do? And so I had to, like, before I could even write the end of this little short video that I was thinking about making, I had to actually like figure out, what am I going to do with this entity that I've personified, that is my own self-doubt and my own feelings of personal inadequacy and incompetency. And so finally I'm just like, you know what? I felt like I was at a crossroads of, I'm either going to keep going and do the things, I'm going to keep making videos, or I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, or I'm going to stop. And so finally I'm just like, I guess I'm just going to keep going. And so in the script, I'm just like, I'm just going to do it anyway. And so as soon as I wrote that, like I realized that, like, I felt this almost weight had been lifted off of me. And I'm like, oh, I feel good making these videos. I feel good doing all this stuff. Now I still feel completely inadequate and I don't belong in certain places, but I'm like, whether I belong there or not, I'm going to continue and pursue whatever it is I'm working on. Like, I'm going to keep making these videos. Though I deleted our entire episode 2 and we just had to re-record it. For those of you on YouTube, you noticed episode 1 had no background, and then episode 2 had a background, and then episode 3 and 4 didn't have a background. That's because we had to go back in time and re-record episode 2, because I deleted all of the audio, and it was awful. And so, like, running into that is like, of course I'm worthless and I don't belong here, because I can't even, like, we're only on episode 2 and I can't seem to keep the files that are vitally important for us to produce a podcast, the audio. Yeah. And so I just decided, like, it really was just am I going to be a hostage to imposter syndrome, or am I going to just do it anyway? And I decided I'm just going to do it anyway. So that being said, I'm weird. I'm not a normal person. I have ADHD, a lot of it. And so.
More than 80 of them.
I do have more than 80 of them. Felt like I had at least 81. I don't know what HD is, but doctor says I've got 80 of them. So, of course, I don't know what I was saying because that was a great joke. So, what about you? How do you get through?
So I've talked about it a little bit. Is I've convinced myself that fear is not good enough. If I can, in those moments when I'm feeling like a fraud, and I try to break down the facts quickly in my head, say, okay, well, here's why I'm here. Here's what I brung to the table to be allowed here. Here's the experiences that I have, and here's what I want to do. And then if I go through all of the reasons why maybe I shouldn't be there, and the only one left is, well, I don't belong. My mental thing is, well, I'm afraid that I don't belong. That's not a good enough answer. And so I stick it out. And, using our brains, that's an example of just use your brain. It really is that simple sometimes. You just say, well, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more intelligent about this. I actually have a tattoo on my arm. I believe it's pronounced magnanimus esto. It's Latin, and it means to be of great mind. It's on my family crest, and I thought it was a great reminder for myself. I mean, that's how deep imposter syndrome went, that I felt that I needed this tattooed on my arm permanently as a reminder to not fall into that trap anymore. So we can be of great mind. We can use our brains. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." God gave us the power of love and power and a sound mind. We can work through these things if we allow ourselves to. We can generally solve problems if we allow ourselves to. The second we allow fear to stop us, we've lost. And that goes for being a good parent. I know for a fact people who have, I guess, lost marriages because they've had imposter syndrome. I've seen people question whether they were good dads because of imposter syndrome. I've seen people lose business. I've lost businesses because of imposter syndrome. And it's a hard fact, a hard truth to look back on and realize that that's all it was. The only reason I lost those things, not my marriage, kids or anything, but business opportunities and relationships probably with groups of people, is because of imposter syndrome. And looking back, there's a lot of shame tied to that now. So I can't believe that that's all I let affect my life. Because when you look back on the thing, you're like, man, what? That wasn't enough to keep me from that.
Yeah.
We cannot allow ourselves the luxury of not working hard for our families, not putting in the work to be a better husband, not putting in the work to be a better dad, not putting in the effort to teach a class, to pour into young men or women around us, or even people our own age in our community, in business, in our daily lives, because, well, I don't really know if I need to really be all churchy and encouraging to that guy who I just found out's getting divorced, because I don't know what his background is. I don't know. I don't have a good relationship with him. So I don't want to be that guy. That's imposter syndrome moving in, whereas you could have just made a vital impact on that guy's life, or person, whatever it is, kid. You'd be encouraging to the kid that got knocked down on the playground, that looks sitting in the corner by himself. I mean, this podcast isn't just for men who are 30 and 40 years old. This is for everyone. I hope that there's some little kids listening to this maybe.
Yeah.
And they go encourage their buddy on the playground, in class, somebody's getting picked on or something, and not allow fear of, not being excluded, whatever it is, not allow that to get in the way of them completing some of God's work.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're called to a much greater purpose than allowing fear to rule our lives.
Completely agree. Thank you for joining us for episode 5 of the Stand Like Men podcast. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join us over at Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube.
Our verse is 1 Corinthians 16, 13, and 14.
Be watchful.
Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong.
Let all that you do be done in love.